Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Freedom Force for PC and Mac. This is a tactics game developed by Irrational Games and published by EA in 2002, and it's actually pretty interesting because superhero games are a rarity these days. I mean, you think about it, what do you get? You get licensed games, you get Champions Online, you got City of Heroes and City of Villains back in the day, and not much else. And you may wonder why that is. It's because superheroes are pretty hard to pull off properly, right? Well, Irrational tried their hand with Freedom Force, and it was basically a tactics game. Some people refer to it as a tactical role-playing game, but there's no role-playing in it. It just uses a few loose RPG elements. But it's a pretty interesting game nonetheless, because, again, it's a tactics game, and you don't normally see that with superhero games. You usually see action, adventure, and that sort of thing. And at the time this was released, superheroes had a really bad reputation in video games. There weren't all that many good superhero games. In fact, I can't think of any off the top of my head that were from before 2002. So the question becomes, did this sort of redeem superheroes in gaming, or what? Well, let's start with the presentation, which at the time was pretty average as far as graphics go. I mean, the graphics quality was up to par with pretty much everything else at the time. The problem is, it doesn't look all that good by today's standards as far as the graphics quality goes. Obviously, it aged quite a bit, and it was a 3D game at the time, so 3D modeling doesn't look as good as it used to. The textures are pretty low res, that sort of thing. But it's not the graphics quality that matters here, actually. Even though the graphics quality hasn't aged all that well, the art style has. They were going for the comic book style, and they nailed it. The game is really bright and colorful, everything is cartoony and goofy looking, and it really does feel like one of those old comic books, as far as the graphics go. And so, despite the graphics not having aged all that well, it still has a nice charm to it. And it's particularly amusing when you have your guys running around whacking thugs upside the head, and it comes up and says, sock, or biff, or whack, or stuff like that, in typical comic book style. Or if you watch the original Batman movie with Adam West, then you know what I'm talking about. It's corny as hell, but it's just got this sort of delight about it. You can't help but like it because it's so goofy. And the sound design carries that. I mean, the sound effects themselves aren't particularly impressive, but they have that sort of comic book quality to them, and that it really does enhance the comic book feel. The music's just kind of but again, it fits the game fairly well. But as far as the sound design goes, the best part of it is obviously the voice acting. Because even though the voice acting isn't particularly amazing, if you just take it for what it is, if you combine it with the fact that they were going for the comic book feel, and it was intentionally cheesy, then you get a kick out of it. Because again, what they're saying is just so incredibly corny. I mean, you have your main character, Minuteman, running up and whacking guys upside the head going, "For freedom!" Almost exactly like that. And so, when you have stuff like that, and it's just so incredibly cheesy, then you can't help but get a kick out of it. Now, admittedly, it does wear on you after a while, but it takes quite a while for that to really happen, so it's not that big of a deal. But what really matters are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this one is that this guy named Mentor is heading to Earth to avoid Lord Dominion and his forces. And so, when he gets to Earth, he's brought these canisters of this Energy X with him. And they end up getting spread all over Patriot City, and people who get exposed to this stuff actually end up developing superpowers. Thus, you have characters like Minuteman and the Ant and so on and so forth, as well as supervillains like Nuclear Winter, for instance. And the entire story is basically Mentor getting all these heroes together and forming Freedom Force in order to fight off these supervillains and their evil plots. And that's really all you need to know. It's styled after the comic books of the time, the 1960s. And as a result, it is corny as hell. And it just revels in being so ridiculously cheesy because that was how they rolled back then. And so it really does capture that 60s comic book feel just perfectly. Now that said, the plot itself isn't that great, but that incredible corniness and that absolute capturing of the comic book feel really does give it this nice charm that makes the story actually end up being slightly better than it really should be if you just look at it from a quality standpoint. So that's kind of an interesting situation. But what about the gameplay itself? Well, it is a tactics game, and you are playing, of course, as Freedom Force, and you're sending them on various missions, and you actually get to upgrade their abilities over time and such like that. The controls themselves are actually very simple. It's all done by the mouse. You can also have keyboard shortcuts. And when you go and you click on things, then it'll have to bring up a menu. It gives you a pretty good tutorial. So that's pretty easy to play through. But it brings up a menu, and you can select an action from that menu, like, say, pick up, or for certain objects anyway, you can pick them up, or to use various abilities that that particular hero has. Or you can just tell them to punch things, or stuff like that. And so it's a very intuitive interface, and although sometimes the pathfinding isn't as great as it should be, usually it's fine, and usually it interprets your actions as what you want it to do. So you probably won't have all that many issues with the game not doing what you want it to do. That said, even though it will probably do what you want it to do, you still have to know what you're doing. Each of the characters has their own set of abilities, and as a result, they have certain strengths and weaknesses. Certain characters are better in melee combat, certain characters are better at range. Some characters are just crap at combat altogether and are better at supporting the other characters. And so you really do have to learn how each of these characters uses their abilities to their best ability. The thing is, if you screw up, then you're going to run into problems, because this game is very unforgiving. It is a very difficult game, which kind of surprised me going into this thing. I wasn't really expecting it to be all that difficult, but when I actually played through it, it's like, wow, this thing is actually really hard. And it never really feels like it's completely unfair difficulty, but there's just certain moments where you're like, well, how am I going to do that? And then when you think about it, you're like, oh, I see how I'm going to do it, okay. And you got to cleverly use tactics to your advantage, and use each of your character's abilities to your advantage. Failure to do so results in you failing miserably. So, it certainly is a tactics game at heart, and it really does reflect that in the gameplay itself. Even though there are actually some light RPG elements, it does actually get described a lot as a tactical role-playing game, even though there's absolutely no role-playing in it at all. It just has some RPG elements, the stat system, and basically getting points that you can spend on actually upgrading character abilities or giving them unlocked abilities, stuff like that. And so you actually do get these points over time by doing various things in the missions, completing side objectives, that sort of thing. And the more points you get, of course, the better your character is going to be. But even when you got your characters upgraded, it's still a difficult game. So it's something where you really do have to think in order to succeed. And even though it is very easy to pick up and play, it's actually rather difficult to master. So it's pretty much exactly what a tactics game should be, except they could ratchet the difficulty down just a bit. That would be my only real complaint with it. Now, some people are obviously going to be put off by the superhero kind of thing, where it's just really cheesy. And they're just like, I'm having a really hard time getting into this because it's just so cheesy. Okay, that's just a personal preference kind of thing. But the tactics part itself, if you're a fan of tactics games, you'll probably really enjoy this game. And if you're a fan of superheroes, you'll probably also enjoy this game. Just be warned, it is a very difficult game, and it requires a lot of patience and thought to actually get through. And while the plot isn't that all that great, that charm is what's going to keep it going for you. So, ultimately, I'll give it a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.